The first blow didn't draw blood, but the girl knew it would by nightfall. Alona Narrowlin knelt on the packed dirt of the Reverend's smokehouse, her small arms shaking under the weight of a log she could barely lift. The sun was just a rumor behind the morning haze, but her back was already a map of pain from an hour of hauling wood in bare feet. Her palms were raw, her knees screaming through the thin cotton of her dress. A line of ants marched past her fingers, their tiny, determined march a mockery of her stillness. They had somewhere to be. She didn't. "You'll work till your sins are sweat from your skin," Margot Bain, the preacher's wife, had hissed at sunrise. The sound of her ladle slapping the iron stove was as sharp as a whip crack. "You've been looking at folks too long with those eyes of yours. That's not humility, girl. That's pride in disguise." Alona said nothing. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. It didn't grow well in the cracked soil of Red Mesa Crossing, especially not in girls like her. Outside, the air was already thick with desert heat. The church bells were silent, but the smell of scorched beans and dry iron hung over the town like a shroud. Far off, a vulture cried out, a sharp, lonely sound that expected no answer. She pushed herself up, the log digging into the fresh welt on her hip, and carried it out into the courtyard. She moved like smoke among the townspeople gathering for Sunday prayer. They didn't see her, or if they did, their eyes slid right off, like she was something too ugly or too sad to look at. Only one man watched. From the deep shadow of the trading post awning, Talon Nashoba stood like a statue carved from rock and regret. His shoulders were square, his arms folded over a chest covered in faded blue ink and the ghosts of old burn scars. His eyes, dark as a moonless night, didn't flinch when they met hers. But Alona looked away first. She always did. She dropped the log near the chapel steps and limped back toward the kitchen, the pain in her hip a hot, angry pulse. Inside, Margot Bain's voice cut through the steam and noise. "Bread needs rising. That stew's gone sour. Someone check the firewood. Where is that girl?" Alona slipped past the doorway carrying an armful of pew cloths, silent and invisible. It was an art she had mastered long ago, to vanish in plain sight, to move like a breath, felt, but never seen, never named. As she knelt to scrub soot from the giant stone hearth, a jolt of pure agony shot up from her thighs. She bit the inside of her cheek, hard, tasting blood, trying to swallow the cry, but a whisper of it escaped, a tiny, shaky gasp. Sister Hallie, a woman older than dust and twice as dry, peered down over her spectacles. "What's wrong with you? Moving like a cow with a broken leg." Alona straightened up too fast. Pain exploded behind her eyes. Her voice, when it came out, was smaller than a prayer. "It hurts when I sit." The kitchen went dead silent. For one single heartbeat, the world stopped. The soup stopped bubbling. The flies stopped buzzing. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Then Sister Hallie scoffed. "Maybe if you didn't slouch like a sinner." She turned away, muttering about spoiled girls and their pity-seeking looks. The other women followed her lead, turning their backs, picking up their tasks. No one asked what she meant. No one wanted to know. It was easier not to. Alona folded back into her work, her face a blank mask, her heart a tight, cold fist in her chest. It wasn't the pain that truly shook her. It was the confirmation. They saw. They knew. And they did not care. Later, she was on her hands and knees behind the chapel, scrubbing the front steps with lye that bit at the cuts on her fingers. The sun was high and cruel now, the sandstone hot enough to cook on. Her dress was soaked through, her knuckles bleeding. Still she worked, each stroke of the brush a mindless, hopeless rhythm. And still, he watched. Across the road, leaning against the hitching post, Talon Nashoba hadn't moved. His horse huffed beside him, stirring the dust that clung to his boots like old sins. He was a man made of silence and shadow, a man who hadn't spoken a word to a soul in this town for years. But he saw her. He didn't just see her with his eyes. He saw her with something older, something broken inside him that recognized the same cracks in her. Their eyes met for a single breathless moment. Her gaze was flat, exhausted, a silent question. His was unblinking, a steady, silent answer. She looked away first again. That night, during the service, Alona sat in the back pew, alone, as always. As she lowered herself onto the hard, polished wood, the pain was a clawed thing tearing up her spine. A sharp gasp escaped her lips before she could stop it. It wasn't loud, but in the reverent quiet, it was enough. A few heads turned. The preacher, Reverend Bain, paused in the middle of his sermon. His smile didn't falter. In fact, it widened. Then his voice rose, louder than before, drowning out the tiny sound of her pain, and the town kept on singing. Alona stared down at her trembling hands. The thin red lines on her knuckles looked like puppet strings. She thought of her mother, long dead, singing as she braided Alona's hair. That memory felt like it belonged to another person, in another lifetime. Outside the chapel doors, the wide brim of a hat cut a dark silhouette against the last of the twilight. Talon was still there, still silent, still watching. Inside, the town of Red Mesa Crossing sang of harmony and grace. Outside, one man refused to look away. Later that night, the Bain house was a tomb of silence. Alona crept up the narrow stairs to the attic crawl space where she slept on a cot without a mattress. Her knees cracked like dry twigs with every step. Margot's voice slithered up from the parlor below. "You embarrassed us today. Whimpering like a kicked dog in God's own house. You think that makes people feel sorry for you?" Alona didn't answer. "You need to learn that pain is a part of obedience," Margot continued, her voice cold and flat. "Tomorrow you'll scrub the chapel steps again, on your bare knees. Maybe the stone will teach you some gratitude." Alona slipped into the attic and shut the door. She didn't cry. She just curled into a tight ball against the wall, a small, still thing in the darkness. Miles outside of town, Talon sat by his fire, sharpening a blade that hadn't seen use in a decade. The steel whispered against the stone, a hungry sound in the night. He wasn't thinking of war. He wasn't thinking of revenge. He was thinking of a voice, a small, honest, unshakable voice. "It hurts when I sit." He had seen her flinch. He had seen the town turn away, and he had made a choice. He wouldn't. The next morning, he would walk into the sheriff's office. After years of silence, Talon Nashoba was finally going to speak. But in a town built on secrets, would anyone even listen? The next morning broke over Red Mesa Crossing like a fever. The sky, usually a sharp, clean blue, hung low and gray, thick with dust that refused to settle. Smoke curled from the chimneys like the houses themselves were holding their breath, waiting. Talon Nashoba was waiting too. He stood at the edge of town before the first rooster crowed, the embers of his campfire dying behind him. He hadn't slept. His blade was cold in its sheath, but his thoughts were sharper. The image of Alona, kneeling on hot sandstone, her eyes hollow, her voice a ghost of a whisper, had burned behind his eyes all night. "It hurts when I sit." It wasn't a complaint. It was a confession. A truth dropped into a well of lies, and he was the only one who had heard it splash. He waited until the town started to stir, until the sound of boots on boardwalks and the creak of wagons filled the air. Then he crossed the street, his steps deliberate and heavy, and pushed open the door to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Rayburn wasn't in, but his deputy, Clayton Wren, was. Clayton was young, with boots that were too new and a badge that was too shiny for a place like this. He looked up from his desk, halfway through tying his neckerchief, and his casual morning smile froze when he saw who had walked in. Morning, Clayton offered, a little too lightly. Talon said nothing. He walked to the center of the room, stopped 3 feet from the desk, and just stared. The silence was a physical thing, heavy and suffocating. Clayton shifted in his chair. "Can I help you with something, Mr. Neshoba?" The words came out of Talon's mouth slow and rough, like stones being dragged from a dry riverbed. "She's bleeding on the inside." His voice was a low, gravelly thing, almost unused. Clayton blinked, confused. "Sorry, what?" Talon took a step closer, his shadow falling across the desk. "The girl, Alona Narralin, the Reverend's ward. She's not safe." Clayton let out a slow breath and leaned back, trying to regain his footing. "Look, Mr. Neshoba, I respect you. Everybody in this town does. But you're walking into something delicate here." "She flinched when she sat down in church. Twice," Talon said, his voice flat and hard. "Her wrists are marked. Her eyes don't land on anything for more than a second. That's not delicate, that's damage." "You got proof?" Clayton asked, his voice taking on an official edge. "I saw." "Seeing ain't proof." Talon's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping under the skin. "It's enough for me." "Well, it's not enough for the sheriff, or a judge, and it's damn sure not enough for Reverend Bain's congregation," Clayton said, lowering his voice. He glanced toward the window. "Folks around here, they'd rather pretend the cracks in the walls are just shadows." Talon took a slow, deep breath, the air whistling through his nose. "I buried a daughter once," he said, his voice dropping even lower. Her voice got smaller every day, until one day it didn't come out at all. By the time I finally heard what she was trying to say without words, she was gone. Clayton looked away, his gaze falling to the worn floorboards. "Don't make the mistake of waiting to believe her until she's quiet for good," Talon said, his eyes boring into the young deputy. "Believe her now." The room suddenly felt too small to hold the air. "You don't understand the kind of man you're up against," Clayton muttered, looking back up. "I don't need to," Talon said. "I've seen his kind before." He turned and walked out without another word, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. That afternoon, Alona moved through the chapel courtyard like a ghost in the blinding sun. The hem of her dress was caked with mud, her hands wrapped in rough, stained linen. She was carrying a tray of hymn books, but her arms were trembling so badly the books rattled with each step. From the porch of the parsonage, Margot Bain watched her, sipping iced tea as if she hadn't pressed a hot spoon to the girl's back just days before. "You missed a spot on the porch rail, girl," she called out, her voice dripping with sweet venom. Alona nodded numbly and turned to go back. But then she stopped. Talon was there again. He stood at the far end of the courtyard, leaning against the water trough. And this time, when their eyes met, she didn't look away. He walked toward her, his steps slow and even, careful not to spook her like a frightened deer. She stiffened as he got closer, her knuckles white on the edge of the tray. "You all right?" he asked. It was only the second time he'd spoken in years, and his voice was still rough with disuse. Alona didn't answer. She just gripped the tray tighter, her eyes darting toward the parsonage. "You don't have to stay quiet," he said, his voice soft but firm. Still, she said nothing. She started to walk past him, her head down. But just as she drew level with him, she spoke, her voice so low it was barely more than the rustle of the wind. That's what they told the last girl. Then she kept walking, disappearing into the dark maw of the church. Talon stood there for a long time after she was gone, the girl's words hanging in the hot, still air. A warning, a prophecy. He didn't know her whole story. Not yet. But you don't need to see every link in a chain to know it's a chain. He thought of his daughter's laugh echoing in the canyons, her hair tangled with wildflowers. He thought of how small she sounded the night before the fever took her for good. And he thought of Alona's voice, low and dry and filled with a truth that the whole town was trying to bury. That same night, Alona was curled up on her attic cot, staring at the warped wooden ceiling. The roof leaked when it rained, and the wind whispered through the slats. Her body was a symphony of aches, her lips were cracked, and her thoughts were as sharp as nails. Below her, in the parlor, she could hear the Reverend studying his scripture, muttering prayers aloud to an empty room. But she heard a different sermon in his tone, something dark, something patient, something waiting. She didn't sleep. She just lay there, whispering into the darkness. Please, don't stop noticing. The next morning, Clayton Wren found Talon waiting by the office door again. I told you yesterday, Clayton started, his voice tired. No proof, no cause. Talon didn't say a word. Instead, he held out his hand. In his palm was a small object wrapped in cloth. He unfolded it. It was a bracelet made of broken beads and a leather cord. It was torn, burned in one spot, and soaked with what looked like old, dried blood. Clayton's face went pale. Found it in the alley, behind the chapel, Talon said. It doesn't belong to her, but it was near the spot where the last girl vanished, the one everyone says ran off. Clayton stared at the bracelet, his breath catching in his throat. That girl? She used to wear one just like this. Talon's eyes locked onto his. Maybe it's time someone asked why she took it off. Later that afternoon, Reverend Ezekiel Bain stood on the chapel steps, that polite, empty smile plastered on his face. He watched Alona below him, scrubbing the stones, her hands raw, her mouth a tight, silent line. He was about to say something, to offer a hollow word of encouragement, when he saw him, across the street. Talon Nashoba, standing there again, arms crossed, eyes locked on him. The Reverend's smile twitched at the corners. He turned without a word and disappeared back inside the church. That evening, as the last rays of sun bled across the mesa, Clayton sat at his desk, staring at the broken bracelet. It felt heavy in his hand, heavier than it should. On impulse, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a letter. A crumpled, forgotten letter he'd meant to throw away months ago. It was from a woman named Chaser, an old Apache woman who used to work in the Bain house before she was run out of town. He unfolded it. He'd only glanced at it before, dismissing it. Now, he read every word. The letters seemed to jump off the page, hitting him like stones to the chest. If someone still listens, please believe her. I was not the first. Clayton stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He reached for his coat. Some things weren't meant to stay buried. Not in the dust. Not in the silence. And miles away, by his fire, Talon murmured the same thought into the darkness, his hand tightening around the hilt of his knife. Not again. The ashes of the past never truly go cold, and he was about to stir them up. The air over Red Mesa Crossing was thick with the smell of smoke and sage. Talon Nashoba rode out before the sun had even thought about climbing the ridge. He followed a trail he hadn't taken in years, a narrow, forgotten path choked with dry mesquite, leading into a stretch of land the town called abandoned. But the land wasn't empty. It had memories. At the edge of a dry arroyo, an old wagon sat crookedly beneath a gnarled piñon tree. A thin whisper of smoke curled from its stovepipe. A couple of horses grazed nearby, their tails flicking at flies. Talon dismounted, tied his mare to a low branch, and waited. He didn't call out. He knew better. After a few moments, the canvas flap of the wagon lifted. A woman emerged, slow and deliberate, her eyes appearing first, scanning the horizon. It was Chaser. Her long gray braid, woven with feathers, hung over one shoulder. She wore no shoes, her feet as tough and weathered as the land itself. "Well," she said, her voice like stones grinding together, "you look like the kind of man who drags ghosts behind him." Talon just nodded once. Need to ask you about one. Chaser gave a half smile that held no warmth, no welcome. Then you best come inside, but wipe your boots. Dust carries things you don't want following you. Inside the wagon, the air was heavy with the scent of herbs and dry tobacco. It was cramped but organized, every inch of space used. She poured him tea from a blackened pot without asking if he wanted any. Name? She asked, sliding a tin cup across the wooden crate that served as their table. Alona Narralin. Chaser's hand paused for a fraction of a second. The Pueblo girl, 17, maybe 18, works in the Bain house. They say she was taken in out of charity. She snorted, a dry, bitter sound. They say a lot of things in Red Mesa. I think she's being hurt, Talon said, his voice flat. She is. Chaser's answer was just as flat, just as certain. She leaned back, her eyes tracing the ceiling beams as if counting the years trapped between them. She came through here last winter, she said softly, looking for herbs for Margot. She was wearing long sleeves in the middle of July, and she walked like her hips were broken. Did you speak to her? Didn't have to, Chaser said, meeting his gaze. I know the look. It was the same one I used to wear. Talon let that hang in the air for a long moment. She said something to me, he added. She said, that's what they told the last girl. He leaned forward slightly. Do you know who the last girl was? Chaser went quiet. Her hand trembled as she reached for a small leather pouch of dried cedar. She took a pinch and held it to her nose, breathing in the scent like it was courage. She had a birthmark under her left eye, Chaser said finally, her voice barely a whisper. Looked like a tiny crescent moon. She used to sing while she was hanging the laundry. Her name was Tessa Maris. Half Dene, half Irish. A pretty thing. Too soft for that house. What happened to her? They said she ran away. Chaser's eyes were hard now, flinty. But she never bought a ticket at the station, and the tracks of her horse went silent just past the wash. Talon felt a slow, hot anger rise in his chest. Why didn't you tell someone? I did, she said, tapping a finger against her own chest. Once, long ago. All it got me was a beating from some of the Reverend's flock, and a fire set to my herb shed that night. Reverend Bain himself delivered the sermon the next day about the dangers of false witness. No proof, no other witnesses, same as it always is. Talon's jaw was a hard line. Do you still have her things? Chaser nodded slowly. She reached under the bench she was sitting on and pulled out a small, worn cloth bundle tied with twine. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small silver locket, a tortoise-shell hair comb, and a torn piece of hymn paper with frantic, scribbled handwriting on it. She gave me these the night before she vanished, Chaser whispered, her voice thick with old grief. She told me, if something happens, don't forget me. Did you? Talon asked. No, Chaser said, her eyes glistening. But I stayed quiet, and sometimes that's almost worse. Talon picked up the items, his calloused fingers gentle. The locket was cold. She mentioned a storage crawl space. Under the Bain house, he said, remembering a detail from Chaser's forgotten letter. Said it smelled of kerosene. Said she heard footsteps down there at night that weren't Margot's. Chaser's eyes narrowed. That space was for coal, back in the day. Ezekiel sealed it up years ago. Said it drew rats. A dark look passed over her face. Maybe it still does. They sat in silence for a moment, the unspoken truth filling the small space between them. Finally, Chaser spoke again. You planning on breaking that seal? If I have to. Chaser let out a long, slow sigh. You do this. You'll bring the wolves down on you. That man holds sway over half this town. The church, the school, even the sheriff's tithe. Talon stood, his large frame filling the wagon. Then it's time someone howled back. Chaser watched him as he carefully wrapped the bundle and strapped it to his saddle. "Be careful, Neshoba," she warned. "Some fires don't just burn wood. They burn people." Outside, the wind had shifted, and dust curled around Talon's boots. He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. Back in town, Alona stood beside the chapel, her hands plunged into a basin of harsh, soapy water, her raw wrists stinging. The sound of hymns drifted from inside, another Wednesday service she wasn't allowed to attend. Across the yard, Margot Bain watched her like a hawk watching a wounded rabbit. "You think because some silent Apache is sniffing around, your world is going to change?" Margot called, her voice sharp. Alona kept scrubbing, her knuckles white. Margot stepped closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "Men like that, they just want broken things to fix. You think he sees you. He sees a burden, a project." Alona's voice, when it came, was quiet, but it didn't tremble. Better to be a burden than a ghost. The slap was so hard and sudden it echoed in the courtyard. Alona's head snapped to the side, but she didn't fall, she didn't cry, she just slowly straightened up, wiped a trickle of blood from her lip with the back of her hand, and turned back to the wash basin. For the first time, Margot Bain hesitated. A flicker of something, fear, uncertainty, crossed her face. Then she turned on her heel and walked away. Inside the chapel, Reverend Ezekiel Bain pressed his palms to the pulpit, his voice ringing with false righteousness. But his eyes were distracted. He had seen Talon ride out of town that morning. He had seen the way Deputy Wren looked at him now. He could feel the very foundations of his world begin to shift, just slightly beneath his feet. That evening, Talon rode back into Red Mesa under the cover of a blood-red dusk. He didn't stop in the town square. He didn't speak to anyone. He rode past the blacksmith, past the saloon, straight to the dark alley behind the chapel. He found the crawl-space door, half buried in sand and debris. The lock rusted shut. Using a pry bar from his saddlebag, he wedged it into the frame and pulled. The metal groaned in protest, then snapped open. The smell hit him first. Kerosene, rot, and something else. Something older and much, much worse. He lit a match. The space wasn't tall enough to stand in. It was filled with old crates, coils of rope, and a torn hymn book. And in the corner, something glinted in the flickering light. A bracelet. Leather. Broken beads, darkened with blood. He picked it up. It matched the one from the alley. And then he saw another, and another, lined up on a dusty shelf. Trophies. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But something inside him, something that had been frozen for years, finally cracked. He resealed the door, climbed back onto his horse, and rode straight for the sheriff's office, the cold weight of the evidence heavy in his pocket. Deputy Clayton Wren was cleaning his rifle when Talon slammed the first bracelet down on his desk. "This was in Bain's crawl space," Talon said, his voice a low growl. Clayton stared at it, his face ashen. That's Tessa's." Talon nodded grimly. "You knew about her!" "Everyone did," Clayton admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "We were told she ran. I believed it. I wanted to." Talon pointed a finger at the bracelet. "She didn't run. She's buried under this town's silence." Clayton's throat was tight. "I have a letter," he said slowly, pulling the paper from his drawer. "From Chaser. She said this isn't the first time." Talon leaned in, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "Then we stop pretending it's the last." Clayton swallowed hard. Then he gave a single decisive nod. Outside, the church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to the Reverend's nightly reading. But something had shifted in the town's pulse. A crack had appeared in the foundation. A single breath had been taken after years of holding it, and one man, standing in the dust, was no longer quiet. In her attic room, listening to the bells, Alona pulled her thin blanket tighter. She could feel the bruises deepening beneath her skin. Maybe I'm next, she thought, but for the first time another thought followed it. Or maybe I won't let them decide. The box under her cot felt heavier than ever before. The storm didn't come with thunder and lightning. It crept in quiet, in the sound of wind rattling dry leaves and shutters that wouldn't stay closed. Alona Nalin stood barefoot in her attic room, her breath a shallow thing in her chest, the hem of her worn dress brushing against the cold floorboards. Below her, the Bain house was finally deeply asleep. Margot had passed out in her rocker in the parlor, a knitting needle still tangled in the shawl across her lap, an empty whiskey glass on the floor beside her. The Reverend hadn't come home. He never did on nights like this, when the wind howled like a hungry animal. Alona knew he was at the chapel, praying for the souls of his flock, while his own soul rotted from the inside out. She moved with a slow, practiced grace, every step rehearsed in the darkness of 100 other nights just like this one. The bruises on her ribs burned with each small movement, but pain had long ago stopped being a reason to stop. It was just a fact, like the rising of the sun. She slid a small, splintered wooden box out from under her cot. Inside, she began to pack her entire life. It didn't take long. A cracked tin of healing ointment, a small, faded photograph of her parents, their faces already blurring in her memory, a frayed scarf her mother had woven, and a tiny, battered Bible, its pages soft from years of thumbing, always open to the same page. Psalm 71. Deliver me, O my God, out of the hand of the wicked, out of the hand of the unrighteous and cruel man. She added a sewing needle, a single silver coin she'd kept hidden behind a loose wall slat, and a hairbrush with only half its teeth. The very last thing she tucked inside was a scrap of paper torn from the back of an old sermon sheet. She wrote on it carefully, her handwriting small but steady. If anything happens to me, give this to the man who noticed. She tied the box shut with a piece of twine and slipped down the stairs, a ghost in her own prison. In the parlor, she paused. Margot let out a soft, gurgling snore. The curtains billowed in the draft from the window, like spirits trying to escape. Alona turned the front doorknob, slowly, slowly. The hinge creaked once, a loud, sharp sound in the silence. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, but Margot didn't stir. Outside, the night air was a shock, cold and sharp against her skin. The sky was a pale, star-dusted canvas. No moon, no noise but the wind. She set the small box down gently on the doorstep, like an offering to a god she no longer believed in. She tucked the note securely beneath the twine. Then she turned her back on the only home she had ever known, and she ran, not fast, not loud. But she ran as if the devil himself were at her heels. Talon Neshoba wasn't sleeping either. He hadn't really slept in days. The blade sat on his lap, half sharpened, but he hadn't touched the whetstone in over an hour. He just sat by his fire, listening to the wind press against the walls of his small cabin, a lonely sound that echoed the emptiness inside him. He didn't know what he was waiting for, but his chest felt tight, like a rope being pulled taut, about to snap. Then came the knock, soft, hesitant. Just 2 taps. He opened the door. She stood there on his doorstep. Alona. Her hair was damp with sweat and mist. Her lips were pale and her eyes were wide with a terror so deep it had burned past tears. Her hands were trembling, but her voice, when it came, was the clearest he'd ever heard it. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He didn't answer. He just stepped aside and held the door open. She crossed the threshold like someone waking from a long, terrible dream. Inside, the fire was burning low but steady. Without a word, Talon poured warm water into a basin and set it on the table. Then he handed her a thick wool blanket. She wrapped it around her shoulders, still standing, still shaking. I left everything, she said, her voice cracking. Good, he replied, his voice a low rumble. She looked up at him, surprised. That's all you're going to say? He met her gaze, his dark eyes steady. Sometimes leaving is louder than shouting. Her mouth twitched, just a little. Not a smile, not yet, but something warmer than fear. She finally sat down near the fire, huddling in the blanket. He poured her a mug of hot, salty broth and didn't ask a single question about what she'd run from. He didn't need to. The story was written all over her. She drank the broth in silence. When she reached for the mug with both hands, the blanket slipped, and Talon saw the deep, ugly bruises wrapped around her wrist, hidden beneath the linen wrap. He didn't comment on them. He didn't touch her. He just quietly placed a small clay jar of healing salve on the table beside her. She nodded once, a silent acknowledgement. No words, just care. Later, she leaned her head against the rough-hewn arm of the chair and closed her eyes. Not asleep, just still. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, no one was asking anything of her. No orders, no scripture, no punishment. Just quiet, just warmth. At dawn, Reverend Bain returned to the parsonage. He paused on the doorstep, his boot nudging the small wooden box. He bent down and picked it up. The note fluttered loose and landed in the dust. Behind him, the door opened. Margot stood there, her hair already pinned tight, her lips a bloodless line. "She's gone," she said, her voice flat. Ezekiel didn't speak. He just stared at the box in his hands. "You think it was that Apache?" Margot asked, her voice laced with venom. He didn't answer right away. He crumpled the note in his fist without even reading it. "I think," he said finally, his voice as cold as a winter grave, "it's time this town remembered who built this church." Margot's eyes narrowed. "You going to make a sermon of it?" "No," Ezekiel replied, his gaze turning toward the chapel, a strange dark light in his eyes. "I'm going to make an example. Red Mesa Crossing woke up late that day, but the news traveled faster than the rising heat. By mid-morning, the whispers were curling through every storefront and saloon. Alona Narralin had run, and she'd run to him. Some said Talon had bewitched her. Others said he'd been waiting for this chance, like a snake in the dust. Most just said nothing, because deep down, in a place they didn't like to look, they knew she hadn't run to him. She'd run from them. Deputy Clayton Wren heard it all from his desk, staring at the collection of bracelets Talon had left him. The sheriff still wasn't back, off handling some railroad dispute up in Durango. Clayton was on his own. He unfolded Chaser's letter again. "I was not the first. Please believe her." He stood, grabbed his coat, and headed for the edge of town, toward the canyons. Talon stepped out of his cabin just before noon. The sun had turned the sky to hammered brass. Alona was standing at the edge of the porch, wrapped in his old, oversized army coat, staring out at the distant canyon line. She didn't ask for food or safety or answers. She didn't have to. He handed her a tin cup of coffee, strong, bitter, and black. She took it. "Thank you," she said softly. He just nodded. Inside the cabin, her small wooden box sat on the table. She'd crept back for it before the sun was fully up, unable to leave it behind. Talon hadn't asked what was inside. He didn't ask questions that didn't matter. Later that afternoon, the sound of hoofbeats echoed up the canyon path. A single rider. Talon stepped out into the yard as the dust rose. Clayton Wren reined in his horse and dismounted, his face grim. "Morning," he said, not looking at Talon, but at the small figure on the porch. Talon didn't answer. Alona didn't move. "You aware that girl is under the official care of the church?" Clayton asked, his voice tight with official duty. "She's not property," Talon said, his voice a low warning. "No, but in this town, reputation is currency, and Reverend Bain doesn't like folks stealing his." Clayton shot back. Talon folded his arms. He ain't owed a damn thing. Clayton sighed, the fight going out of him. Look, Talon, just bring her back. Let this all quiet down. She stays, Talon said flatly. Then Alona stood, stepping forward. Her voice was steadier than the wind. I'm not a fugitive. Clayton looked at her then. He really looked. He saw the faint yellowing of a bruise beneath the powder on her cheek. He saw the stained wrist wrap. He saw the bone-deep exhaustion in her shoulders. His jaw clenched. Finally, he just shook his head. Bane won't take this lying down. None of them will. He mounted his horse and rode off without another word. That night, Talon hitched a mule to a small, sturdy cart. Alona stood by the barn, her face etched with confusion. You're leaving? He shook his head. We are. I don't want to run, she said, her voice firm. We're not running, he said, looking her straight in the eye. We're moving forward. She hesitated for only a moment. Then she climbed into the cart and sat beside him. They didn't speak for miles. The only sounds, the creak of the wheels over the dusty track and the steady hoofbeats of the mule. As the lights of Red Mesa Crossing shrank to tiny, insignificant sparks behind them, Talon handed her a folded scrap of paper. It was a hand-drawn map, smudged and rough. A safe house? She asked. No, he said, his eyes on the trail ahead. Just space. I've got friends up near Dry Creek Ridge, old Army folk. They don't ask questions. She folded the map and tucked it deep inside her coat. For the first time, they didn't look back. She had run without a sound, but now, someone else was about to make noise for her. The town's reckoning was coming, and it would leave blood in the dust. The trail to Dry Creek Ridge wasn't on any town map. It was a ghost of a path, winding between dry gulches and spines of red rock, the kind of place only the wind and old blood knew how to find. Talon Nashoba guided the mule cart through the dust, his hands light on the reins, his eyes constantly scanning the canyon walls, as if he expected the stones themselves to move. Alona Narrowlin sat beside him, wrapped in his old army coat, her small wooden box clutched tightly in her lap. She hadn't spoken since sunrise, but he could feel her thoughts, a tight knot of fear and something else, something heavier. After another mile of silence, her voice came out small but clear. They'll come for me? Talon didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon. Then we won't be here when they do. They rode on. Around midday, the wind picked up, howling through the canyons, snapping dry branches overhead. Talon guided the cart down into a narrow wash, toward an old, forgotten homestead tucked beneath the shelter of a massive cliff wall. It was just the bones of a house now. The roof was mostly gone, but the stone walls were still strong, built with a stubbornness that had outlasted its builder. Alona stared at it, her eyes wide. This was yours? My grandfather's, Talon said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. He raised goats here, before the relocations. He unhitched the mule and began to unpack their meager supplies. Water skins, dried venison, a few rounds of ammunition. Alona walked to the edge of the ruined cabin, running her fingers along the cool, rough stone. It's quiet here, she said. Quiet doesn't mean safe. No, she agreed, turning to face him, but it means I can breathe. She looked him directly in the eye. Thank you. For not asking me to explain. Talon stopped what he was doing and met her gaze. You don't owe the truth to people who only want to use it against you. Alona nodded slowly, a world of gratitude in that one small movement. Then, as if his words had unlocked something deep inside her, she spoke the words that had been poisoning her from the inside out. He used to come into my room, after prayers. He said it was God's test. That pain was a part of obedience. Talon froze, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. She didn't look away. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if she were reciting a grocery list. Margot always said I should be grateful. That charity comes with a cost. His fists tightened, his knuckles turning white. For a long time, I thought maybe I was the one who was wrong, she whispered, her voice finally trembling. Until you didn't look away. Talon took a step closer, placing a hand on the broken porch rail. The wood was old and splintered, just like the lives they were both trying to mend. You weren't wrong. They stood there in the dry, whipping wind, the silence between them turning into something stronger than words. A shared understanding, a silent vow. By sunset, they had a small fire lit in the stone hearth. The mule was fed and watered. Alona had found a corner of the cabin that was sheltered from the wind. She sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, a tin cup of water held in her hands. Talon handed her a folded blanket. I'm not going back, she said suddenly, her voice fierce. No matter what they promise, no matter who comes knocking. He nodded. You believe me? The question was a fragile thing, a bird with a broken wing. He looked at her then, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. I buried a girl once, he said, his voice thick with an old, raw pain. A girl nobody believed. Miles away, in Red Mesa Crossing, Deputy Clayton Wren sat behind his desk as dusk swallowed the light from the windows. The sheriff was still gone. The Reverend hadn't shown his face all day. The town was buzzing with a nervous, angry energy. Clayton stared down at Chaser's letter again. I was not the first. Please believe her. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the small silver locket Talon had found, the one that had belonged to Tessa Maris. He was staring at it when a knock came at the door. It was a young boy from the telegraph office holding a slip of paper. Message came through from Abilene, Deputy, the boy said. Didn't know who else to give it to. Figured you'd know what to do with it. Clayton took the paper. His hands felt cold as he unfolded it. It was another letter. The words were short, stark, and brutal. She was quiet, just like the rest. He called her God's Lamb. She disappeared 2 months after she arrived. I never forgot her name. Alona. It was signed only with the initials C. T. Clayton didn't wait. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his gun belt, saddled his horse, and rode straight for the ridge, the telegraph slip clutched in his hand. Night fell fast and hard in the canyon. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries echoing off the rock walls. Alona sat by the fire, holding the rough map Talon had given her. Who are these people? She asked, pointing to the symbols etched near the top of the map. The ones at Dry Creek Ridge? Old Army unit, Talon said, cleaning his knife by the firelight. Scouts, some Apache, some Cheyenne, a few Diné. We all served in the same blood and mud, just not always under the same flag. They'll help. They won't ask questions. She nodded. That's enough. Then they heard it. Footsteps, crunching on the gravel path, not Talon's steady tread. They both froze, every muscle tensed. Talon stood slowly, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. From the dark brush near the trail, a horse emerged, its rider hidden in the shadows. Then a figure stepped into the flickering firelight. It was Clayton. He held his hands up, slow and open. I ain't here for trouble. Talon didn't relax his stance. Clayton's eyes found Alona. I got something, he said, his voice rough with dust and urgency. You need to read it. He held out the telegraph slip. Alona took it, her hand trembling. Her eyes flew across the page. Her breath hitched. Then she looked up, her eyes wide with a terrible, dawning realization. There were more, she whispered. Clayton nodded grimly. Enough to fill every pew in that church. She folded the letter carefully, her movements precise, deliberate. Then she looked at Talon, her gaze unwavering. I have to go back. Talon didn't move, his face a mask of stone. I have to tell them, she said, her voice gaining strength with every word. All of them. He stared into the fire. "They'll twist it," he said, his voice low. "They'll call you a liar. They'll say you tempted him." "I know. You sure about this?" She held up the letter. "This is the first time someone else has said my name and meant it. I can't let it be the last." Clayton took a slow breath. "I'll ride with you. I'll stand beside you if it comes to that." Talon looked from the young, determined deputy to the girl who was no longer a girl, but a warrior forged in fire and silence. Then he gave a single, sharp nod. He stood and stepped out into the darkness to ready the cart. Alona followed him, pausing to look up at the vast, star-filled sky above the ridge. For the first time in weeks, the stars didn't look cold and distant. "I'm not running anymore," she said, to him, to the night, to herself. "I'm ready to speak." The church bell rang at high noon. It wasn't ringing for a wedding or a funeral or even for Sunday worship. It was ringing for something no one in Red Mesa Crossing had ever witnessed before. A testimony. Inside the chapel, the air was thick and heavy, smelling of dust, sweat, and fear. The pews were packed. Men in stiff Sunday collars, women with their hands folded so tightly their knuckles were white, children who had been told in harsh whispers not to make a sound. No one knew exactly what was about to happen, but the whispers had been flying all morning. The Apache took her. "She's back. She has something to say." At the front of the chapel, Reverend Ezekiel Bain stood behind his pulpit, as still and imposing as a stone idol. His hands gripped the polished wood on either side of his Bible. His eyes scanned the crowd, a tight, cold smile pinned to his lips. In the front pew, Margot sat ramrod straight, her face pale, her lips pressed together so hard they had disappeared. Then the heavy back doors creaked open. Alona Narralin stepped inside. She wasn't hiding behind anyone. She wasn't wearing the drab gray of a servant. She wasn't bowing her head in shame. She walked down the center aisle with the same quiet, deliberate steps she had used to scrub this very floor. Except now, she didn't look down. She looked straight ahead, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the people who had pretended not to see her for so long. She walked as if she belonged there. Behind her, a step to her right, Deputy Clayton Wren followed in silence, one hand resting on the stack of letters in his coat pocket, the other on the heavy weight of his badge. Alona stopped at the base of the altar. She looked up at the Reverend. His mouth opened, a protest already forming on his lips. She spoke first, her voice soft, but carrying to every corner of the silent church. "Don't worry. I won't be long." A wave of murmurs rippled through the pews. She turned to face the congregation. "I grew up in this town thinking that silence was safety," she began, "that if I didn't speak, I would survive." She held up a single, folded piece of paper. "But someone else broke that silence for me, so now I'm going to return the favor." She opened the letter. Chaser's first one, written in a slanted, angry hand. She read the words slowly, clearly. He called it a test. He said obedience was sacred. That pain was a part of God's grace. He told me not to cry, but I did. Alona lowered the paper. "That wasn't written about me," she said, her eyes finding the faces in the crowd. "That was written about Tessa Maris. She vanished 2 winters ago. Some of you said she ran away." She scanned the pews, watching as faces looked down, as husbands and wives refused to meet each other's eyes. She raised her voice, just a little, the sharp edge of her own pain finally breaking through. "She didn't run, and I didn't either." More murmurs. Someone in the back whispered, "Lies." Alona held her ground. Her gaze was a physical force. "I said, it hurts when I sit. You heard me, in the kitchen in this very church. You all heard me." The silence that followed was deafening. "And you turned your heads," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a sound more damning than a shout. A woman in the third pew shifted uncomfortably. Sister Hallie. She cleared her throat, but said nothing. Alona's gaze lingered on her for a moment before moving on. I didn't come here today to punish you. I didn't even come here to ask for justice. I came here for memory, just so the next girl doesn't have to whisper. A loud creak of wood cut through the tension. The Reverend stepped out from behind the pulpit, his face flushed with rage, his voice a roll of thunder. This is blasphemy! This is the house of God, and I have served him faithfully with every breath. Clayton stepped forward, placing himself between the Reverend and Alona. Then you won't mind letting her finish? Bain's eyes darkened, turning on the deputy. You think one letter from a bitter old woman makes any of this true? Clayton reached into his coat and pulled out 2 more pieces of paper. This one's from Abilene, he said, his voice ringing with authority. Signed by a girl who was in your care 6 years ago. He held up the second slip. And this one came by telegraph just last night, from a woman who tried to report you a decade ago and got run out of town for it. Gasps rippled through the church. A chair scraped loudly against the floor. Margot stood up. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. But her hand flew to her mouth as if to stifle a scream, as if something deep inside her had finally, irrevocably cracked. The Reverend's face turned a mottled red. You think you can ruin a man of God with rumors and the fantasies of broken women? No, Alona said, her voice suddenly as hard and sharp as broken glass. I think you ruined your own life the moment you touched a child and had the arrogance to call it holy. The room held its breath. The entire town, in that one moment, was a single, silent witness. Then, slowly, hesitantly, one woman stood up. Sister Darlene. She didn't speak. She just stood. Then another woman rose. Clara Ross, a widow from the edge of town. Then, from the side door where she had slipped in unnoticed, Chaser stood, her face a mask of grim vindication. Even Margot, the Reverend's loyal wife, slowly, shakily, sat back down, her eyes glassy and vacant, staring at nothing. Outside, the sun dipped behind a curtain of dust clouds, and the light filtering through the stained glass windows turned smoky and gray. Alona folded the letters and stepped down from the altar. I don't want your pity, she said, her voice clear and strong. I want no more silence. She walked back down the aisle, past the rows of people who would never see her the same way again. Not as a servant, not as a charity case, but as a witness. At the open doors, Talon Neshoba stood waiting. He hadn't entered the church. Not out of fear, but out of respect. He knew this wasn't his fire to walk through. This was hers. She stepped out into the dusty sunlight and stood beside him. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't shaking. She just looked up at him. They stood, she said. He nodded once. Good. Inside, the Reverend still gripped the pulpit, his knuckles white, but the church had already turned its back on him. Later that evening, as an uneasy quiet settled over the town, Clayton sat alone in his office reading every single letter one more time. He filed them carefully into a thick evidence envelope, marked it with the address of the circuit judge in Durango, and locked it in a drawer. Then he stood and looked out the window toward the chapel. For the first time in memory, the evening bell didn't ring. No one had pulled the rope. Talon and Alona returned to the old homestead late that night, their cart creaking through the pass just after the moon had risen. She unpacked her small wooden box, placing its contents on a newly built shelf. Talon watched her. I don't just want to rest here, she said, not looking at him. I want to build here. He nodded. We'll need to fix the roof before the rains come. The rains don't come until summer. He looked at her, a rare, small smile touching his lips. You planning to stay that long? She didn't answer with words, but her smile did. The altar had burned today, but not with holy fire. It had burned with the truth. The chapel sat empty. For 2 days after Alona Narralane stood at the pulpit and cracked the town's silence wide open, no one rang the bell. The pews, once polished smooth by decades of Sunday habit, began to gather a fine layer of dust. The flowers on the altar wilted and died. Reverend Ezekiel Bain hadn't shown his face. Not at the bakery, not at the post office, not even at the general store where he used to hold court between the sacks of flour and grain. But this quiet wasn't peace. It was the tense, coiled silence before a strike. The town buzzed, but only in back rooms, behind drawn curtains, in hushed and hurried whispers. Some said the girl was a liar, a temptress sent by the devil. Some said she was the bravest soul they'd ever seen. Most weren't sure what to believe. They only knew that something had been broken, and they were terrified of where the pieces would land. Margot Bain had become a ghost in her own house. She'd locked herself in the parsonage, the drapes drawn tight against the light, her husband's big leather Bible left untouched on the parlor table. As for the man himself, he had simply vanished. Not fled, at least not officially. His boots and hat were still by the door. His coat was still on its peg. But no one in Red Mesa Crossing could say where he'd gone. Deputy Clayton Wren walked the edge of town every morning, his eyes scanning the outer trails for any sign. Fresh hoof prints, the smoke from a hidden fire, any trace at all. He didn't find Bain, but he found something else. A tension in the air so thick you could taste it. Knives hidden behind smiles, whispers with sharpened edges. With the sheriff still away, the badge on Clayton's chest felt heavier each day, and every time he passed someone on the street, they looked at it like it might tarnish right before their eyes. Up at the old homestead, the days were filled with the hard, honest work of rebuilding. Talon mended the broken porch rail, the rhythmic sound of his hammer echoing in the quiet canyon. Alona stripped the old dusty bedding from the cots and hung fresh linen out to dry in the sun, the white sheets billowing in the breeze like prayer flags. She still moved slowly, favoring her left hip, but her steps had a purpose now, a rhythm that was all her own. That afternoon, she found him boiling water in a rusted kettle over the fire pit. She sat down on a log beside him, her hands stained with the good dirt from planting sage along the new fence line. "You hear anything?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Town's stirring," Talon said, not looking up from the fire. "Not sure in which direction yet." "It doesn't matter," she said, watching the flames crackle and spit. "I said what I came to say." Talon stirred the pot with a stick, once, slow and steady. "Saying it don't mean they're done listening." "No," she agreed. "But I don't need them to follow me. I just need them to remember." He gave her a small, approving nod. She hesitated for a moment. "Did you ever regret it?" she asked. "Speaking up?" Talon stopped stirring. He looked out toward the distant hazy ridgeline. "Only every time I stayed silent," he said, his voice low and rough. "Every time I buried something I shouldn't have." She didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. Near dusk, a lone rider appeared at the mouth of the canyon pass. Talon spotted him from the bluff above the homestead. He didn't need a spyglass to see the way the man sat in the saddle, tense, aggressive, his hand never straying far from the rifle in his scabbard. This wasn't a lost traveler. Talon returned to the cabin quietly, saddled his own horse, and waited in the shadows of the barn. The rider dismounted at the fence line, his movements jerky and impatient. "Looking for someone," Talon called out, his voice calm and steady, carrying easily in the still air. The man turned, startled. He had narrow, snake-like eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth. Not a local, but not from far off either. "Preacher says there's a girl up here," the man sneered. "A liar who doesn't know her place." Talon's eyes stayed steady. "Is that so?" "He says she's dangerous. Says she needs to be reminded of God's law." "And you believe him?" The man spat a stream of tobacco juice near the fence post. "I get paid to deliver messages. Sometimes the messages come with bruises." Talon took a slow step forward, out of the shadows. "Then you're leaving with one." The man didn't flinch. He just laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You got no law out here, old man." "No," Talon said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "But I've got memory." Before the man could even think about pulling his rifle, Talon had closed the distance between them. There was a blur of motion, a twist, a step, and the butt of Talon's own rifle cracked hard against the man's ribs. The man's rifle dropped to the dirt with a thud. He followed it a second later, hitting the ground with a grunt, spitting blood and curses. Talon leaned down, his face just inches from the man's. "You go back," he said, his voice a low growl. "You tell him she's not alone, and you tell him next time I don't stop at the ribs." The man scrambled up, clutching his side, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and fear. He limped back to his horse, hauled himself into the saddle, and galloped away without looking back. That night, Alona sat on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "You think he'll come himself next time?" she asked. Talon sat beside her on the top step, sharpening his blade. The whisper of steel on stone was the only sound. "Maybe." She was quiet for a long moment. Would you kill him?" "If I had to." "I don't want any more blood," she whispered. "I know," he said, "but I don't want you to run any more either." "I won't." She leaned her head back against the rough wooden post. Inside the cabin, one of the letters from Abilene sat folded on the windowsill. The ink was already starting to fade, but the words still held their weight. She could see them in her mind. If someone still listens. She smiled, a small secret thing in the darkness. He listened, she whispered to the stars. The next morning, Clayton rode into town early. He dismounted outside the saloon and walked straight into the back room, where a few of the town's older, more respected men were playing cards and sipping whiskey. He didn't say a word. He just dropped the entire bundle of letters onto the center of the poker table. "You all remember Tessa Maris?" he asked, his voice cutting through the smoky air. The men froze, their cards held mid-air. One of them, the blacksmith, nodded slowly. "Worked at the parsonage. Pretty girl. Ran off." Clayton tapped the pile of letters. "She didn't run. She didn't just disappear." She was silenced, just like these other girls were. "Now hold on, deputy," one of them said, his voice blustering. "This is just paper. This don't mean Bain did anything." "She said it," Clayton said, his voice rising. "Alona said it. 3 other girls from 3 other towns said it, and I'm done playing blind just because it's easier." "You're siding with an Apache against a man of God," the man accused. "No," Clayton said, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "I'm siding with the truth." He turned and walked out, leaving the letters on the table. He didn't care if they read them or burned them. The seeds had been planted. By the end of the week, the chapel had reopened. But only a few people came. The pews sat mostly empty. Margot was gone, her house sold for lumber, her name already fading from memory. And Ezekiel Bain was gone, too. No note, no sermon, just vanished into the canyons. Some said he'd headed north to start over. Some said he rode out into the desert and never came back out. No one organized a search party. No one really asked. Because deep down, a part of them knew. They had let it happen. They had nurtured the monster in their midst with their silence, and they didn't want to look too closely at what that said about them. But some did remember. Sister Darlene started sweeping the chapel steps again every morning, even though no one came to services. Chaser began leaving small bundles of dried herbs at the altar, offerings to a different kind of spirit. And a young boy named Eli, whose mother had once worked in the Reverend's kitchen, stopped by every few days to water the flowers that Alona had once tended. The silence had been cracked, and in that crack, something small and green and honest had finally started to grow. Talon had told Alona that if the law wouldn't protect her, then he would. But as they stood on the porch of their rebuilt home, they both knew it was the truth that would protect them now. The truth and the town that was finally, painfully, learning how to remember. Spring came late to the high desert, but when it came with a quiet, stubborn ferocity. The rains washed the dust from the canyon walls, filled the dry arroyos with trickling silver streams, and pushed stubborn green shoots up through the hard-packed earth. The wildflowers bloomed first along the high ridges, bright, defiant bursts of red and yellow and purple against the ancient rock. Then, slowly, they crept down into the valley like hope refusing to be hurried. At the edge of that valley, a house that had once been only bones now stood whole again. Talon Neshoba stood on the porch, a hammer in his hand and sweat on his brow, and looked out over the small field he had begun to turn. A neat line of sage grew along the fence line. A new chicken coop, crooked but sturdy, stood beside the barn. And inside the house, Alona Narralin was reading aloud. Her audience was a young girl with scraped knees and braids as wild as the desert wind. Her name was Lena, a child Chaser had taken in from a village downriver, the kind of quiet, watchful child who flinched at loud voices and never asked for seconds, even when her belly was empty. Alona read slowly, her voice clear and steady, her finger tracing each word on the page as if it deserved to be touched with reverence. Talon listened from the porch, not saying a word. He didn't need to. That sound, the voice of a girl who had once whispered, "It hurts when I sit," now teaching another to find her own, was the loudest, most beautiful thing in the world. Down in Red Mesa Crossing, things didn't go back to normal, because everyone finally understood that normal had been the problem. The chapel still stood, but it had changed. It no longer belonged to one man's ego. It belonged to the handful of people who kept showing up, quietly, humbly, with more questions than answers. Clayton Wren didn't become the new sheriff. He didn't want the title. But folks started coming to him anyway when things felt wrong, when a deal seemed unfair, or a voice was being ignored. And he listened. Sister Darlene, the same woman who had once dismissed Alona's pain, started a small school in the back room of the now empty saloon. It was for any girl who wanted to learn to read. There were no sermons, no scripture unless someone asked for it. Just books, just voices, just choices. Margot Bain never returned. Her name was quietly struck from the town records, a page too painful for anyone to reread. And Ezekiel Bain's name, while never officially cleared, was never spoken much either. Some ghosts are buried by time. Others are buried by a willful, collective silence. He had fed on their silence for so long, it was only fitting that it was what finally erased him. No one ever built him a grave. Up on the ridge, where the trail to the homestead split off from the main pass, a mailbox now stood. It was hand-carved from pinon wood, painted a soft, dusty blue. A single word was etched into it, first in Apache and then in English beneath it, Nalan. It meant, "She who survives." Letters started to arrive every month or so, from places far beyond Red Mesa. Abilene, Tucson, even Santa Fe. Some were short, just a few lines. Others were pages long, filled with stories that echoed Alona's own. They were all written by girls. Girls who had once thought they were alone. Girls who now knew better. Alona kept them in a wooden chest beside her bed, tied in bundles with twine and sprigs of dried lavender. On the hard days, when the memories felt like ghosts at her shoulder, she would read them aloud to Lena. On the good days, she would let Lena read them back to her. Every single letter ended the same way. "I believe you. And because of you, I believe me." One evening, just before the monsoon winds returned to the valley, Alona stood beside Talon on the porch. She held a small, folded piece of paper in her hand. It was worn and creased, the edges curled with age. It was the note she had left in the box all those months ago, back when she thought she might die without anyone ever knowing her name. "I think it's time," she said. "For what?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "To burn it." Talon didn't answer. He just struck a match against the heel of his boot and handed it to her. She lit the corner of the paper and held it, watching the flame curl upward, turning the desperate words to black ash. Then she dropped it into the fire pit and watched the last of her old silence turn to smoke and disappear into the vast twilight sky. She didn't cry. There was nothing left to grieve. There were only things left to grow. Talon reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out something small and silver. He handed it to her. It was the locket, Tessa Maris's locket. Alona opened it. Inside was the faded photograph of a girl caught mid-laugh, her mouth open, her eyes squinting against the sun, pure joy spilling out of her like it had nowhere else to go. "I think she'd be proud of you," Talon said quietly. Alona nodded, her throat tight. She wasn't weak. "No," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "Neither were you." She looked down into the small field, where Lena was now chasing a chicken in giddy, crooked circles, her laughter echoing up to the porch. "I want more of this," Alona said, her voice soft but sure. "Not revenge, not even justice. Just this. Just life." Talon smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up his weathered face. "You've already got it." They stood there in the growing darkness, in a comfortable silence, not because they were afraid to speak, but because silence no longer meant fear. It meant peace. It meant healing. The wind picked up, warm and smelling of the coming rain. Alona reached out and took Talon's hand, not because she needed saving, but because she finally understood what it meant to be held and what it meant to be believed. She didn't need to be remembered as a victim. She would be remembered as the one who made remembering possible. And the story didn't end there. It never does. Not when someone finally finds the courage to tell the truth loud enough for others to echo it. If you believe that one voice can change the world, hit that subscribe button. And never, ever look away.